The lantern threw long shadows across the barn floor when Garrett Calloway stepped inside. He had not expected to find anything. What he found stopped him cold. She was sitting in the corner where the clean straw was deepest, his two children asleep in her arms, their small hands fisted in the folds of her dress. She was singing through her tears, rocking them with a steadiness that the whole mountain could not match. She did not know he was there. She did not know he was watching. She had been hired to clean the barn. She had done something else entirely. This is the story of how a woman with nothing left to lose arrived on a mountain that had forgotten what warmth felt like and what happened when she refused to leave. The lantern threw long shadows across the barn floor when Garrett Calloway stepped inside. He had not expected to find anything. A restless horse, maybe. A loose board rattling in the November wind. He had been ranching this mountain for 15 years, and he knew its sounds the way other men knew their own heartbeat. What woke him that night was not a sound he recognized. It was the absence of one. The crying had stopped. Nora and Edmund had been crying since sundown. That was nothing new. 3 years old and already familiar with the particular grief of children who had lost something they could not name and could not explain and could not stop reaching for in the dark. Garrett had stood at their door with his hat in his hands and his jaw clenched against the helplessness that lived in him like a stone. He had tried everything a man like him knew how to try, and then somewhere past midnight the crying had simply stopped. He followed the quiet. The barn was warm from the horses and the stored hay, and the lantern in his hand made the shadows sway like something living. He moved past the stalls and then he stopped. She was sitting in the corner where the clean straw was deepest, her back against the post, and her knees drawn up slightly, and in the curve of each arm she held one of his children, Nora on the left, Edmund on the right, both of them asleep with the deep and absolute surrender of children who have finally been reached by something their bodies needed and their father had not known how to give. The woman was singing. He could not make out the words. It was barely above a whisper, a melody that moved in slow circles, the kind of song that did not ask anything of the listener, only offered something. Her eyes were closed, her face was pale in the lamplight, and there were tracks on her cheeks from tears she had not bothered to wipe away. And still she kept singing, kept rocking, kept holding them as though the whole mountain and everything on it might be steadied by the steadiness of her arms. Garrett Calloway stood in the doorway of his own barn and did not move. Something in his chest, which had been locked and bolted since the night Ruth died, shifted in a way that frightened him more than anything the mountain had ever thrown at him. He had not expected this. He had not prepared for this. He turned and walked back to the house in the dark. But he did not forget what he had seen. 2 weeks earlier, there had been no Josephine Wren in his life, and the barn had smelled only of horses and hard work, and his children had cried every night, and he had told himself that was just the way things were. 2 weeks. That was all it had taken for the mountain to change its shape. This is where the story begins. Not in the barn where it would eventually find its heart, but on a train platform in Philadelphia on a gray September morning in 1876 with a woman who had nothing left to lose and one small packet of flower seeds in her coat pocket. Josephine Wren was 23 years old, and she had learned in the particular school of a hard life that hope was most dangerous when it looked most like a reasonable plan. She had been standing at that platform for 11 minutes before the westbound train arrived, long enough to reconsider everything and still not move. The advertisement was folded in her other pocket, worn soft at the creases from being read and unread and read again across the previous 3 weeks. Widower, 35 years of age, 2 small children, Mountain Ranch, Montana territory, seeking honest woman of good character for domestic partnership and legal marriage. Hard life fair man. 2 words had stopped her the first time she read it. Hard life. Most advertisements for mail-order situations dress the reality up in softer language. This one had not bothered. And beside those 2 words in the same plain hand, 2 more. Fair man, not kind, not generous, not loving, fair. She had read those 2 words 7 times before she understood why they mattered to her more than any of the others. She had not had much experience with men who were fair. Josephine had grown up in the house of her Aunt Martha Crane, who was not unkind but who was precise about ledgers in the way that some people are precise about mathematics. Every meal Josephine ate was noted. Every piece of mending she did not complete was noted. Her mother had died when she was 9, her father when she was 16, and the inheritance, such as it was, had gone to cover debts that her father had not mentioned in his lifetime. Aunt Martha had taken her in as an act of practical charity and had expected practical return, which was reasonable in its way, but which had left Josephine 7 years later with the specific exhaustion of a person who has never once been an end in herself. Always a means, always a figure in someone else's accounting. 3 years before the train platform, she had made the mistake that people make when they are lonely and not yet wise enough to know the difference between warmth and a fire that will burn them. A man named Birch Colton, who sold dry goods and had a way of looking at her that felt like being seen for the first time. She had married him quickly, the way drowning people grab at things, and she had been happy in the way that people are happy before they understand the full terms of what they have agreed to. The child came in the 7th month and did not survive. A boy. She had felt him move the day before. In the morning he was still. She had laid in the bed of the house she shared with Birch Colton, while the doctor said things she did not hear, and when she turned to look at her husband, she had already known from the particular quality of his stillness that he was calculating his options. He left on a Tuesday, 8 days after the burial. She did not see him again. The doctor told her, with the careful indirection of a man delivering news he does not want to be remembered, for delivering that her body had sustained damage in the loss, that another child would be unlikely, that she should not plan her life around the expectation of one. She had sat with that information for a long time. She had sat with the name she had chosen and never used the one she kept folded in the back of her mind, the way she kept the packet of seeds in her coat, because some things you carry not because they make you lighter, but because putting them down would mean admitting that the weight had beaten you. She had gone to work in the kitchen of Mrs. Elspeth Crane's boarding house, which was not the same Crane as her aunt, but was a similar kind of woman, precise and practical, and she had worked there for 14 months and learned to make herself useful in ways that left no room for self-pity, which was perhaps the most useful thing she ever learned. When the advertisement appeared, she had read it on her lunch break, sitting on a crate in the back alley, with the newspaper folded to that page, and she had understood immediately that this was a door. Not a beautiful door, not a door she had ever imagined herself standing in front of, but a door that was open, which was more than most of what had been offered to her in 23 years of living. She had written her reply that same evening. She had not described herself in flattering terms. She had not made promises she was not sure she could keep. She had written plainly the way the advertisement had been written plainly, and she had ended with a single sentence that she had not planned, but which had come out of her pen as though it had been waiting there. I am not looking for promises. I am looking for a place worth staying. She had mailed the letter before she could revise it. She had received a reply within 3 weeks, which was faster than she expected. Written in a hand that was blunt and economical, with words in a way that reminded her of the advertisement itself. Accommodations provided from the date of arrival. Marriage to take place within 30 days. Duties to include household management and care of 2 children aged 3. Wages of $12 per month against room and board. Arrangement to be reviewed at 6 months by mutual agreement. It was not a love letter. She recognized something more reliable than that. She had signed the placement contract the following morning and spent the next 2 weeks settling what small affairs she had to settle and acquiring the few additional items of clothing that the placement officer suggested would be appropriate for a mountain winter. She had packed everything she owned into one canvas bag, and at the last moment before she closed the clasp, she had added the packet of seeds that had been sitting on the windowsill of her boarding house room since she arrived. Her mother had grown these flowers yellow and white against the gray city and had once told her that flowers could grow anywhere there was someone willing to tend them. Josephine had believed that then. She was trying to believe it still. The train platform fell away behind her, and the city fell away behind that, and the land opened up in ways that the East had not prepared her for. She watched it through the window for hours at a time, the way the distances changed, the way the sky became a larger and more serious thing the farther west she traveled. She was not frightened. She was something more complicated than frightened. She was a person in transit between one version of her life and another, with no guarantee that the other side would be better, only the certainty that the side she was leaving had run out of anything left to offer her. She thought about the children. Two of them, the letter had said, age 3. She had not spent much time with small children. She had no siblings, no cousins nearby, no experience of what it meant to be responsible for someone that young and that entirely dependent. But she had been 3 years old once, and she had lost her mother eventually, and she thought she understood something about what it meant to be small in a world that had not arranged itself to accommodate your smallness. She would figure out the rest when she got there. Delwood, Montana territory was smaller than she had imagined, and more beautiful in a way she had not expected. The mountains were not the distant, blue suggestion of mountains that she had seen from train windows further east. They were immediate and enormous, close enough that she could see the individual dark lines of the pines on their faces, and the white that had already gathered on the highest points in the sky above them was the particular deep blue of altitude in October that she had no prior reference for. She was the only passenger who descended at Delwood. The street outside the depot was unpaved, and there were horses hitched in front of the general store, and the sound of a hammer from somewhere she could not identify, and the smell of wood smoke that she would later associate permanently and without exception with home. 3 men were standing at the edge of the platform. She had known there would be 3. The letter had mentioned brothers. But knowing a thing and encountering it are different orders of experience. And she stood for a moment at the top of the depot steps with her canvas bag in both hands and looked at them with the attention she had learned to give to situations that would require careful navigation. They were very large. She registered this as a practical fact rather than an intimidating one because she had spent 7 years learning to assess men quickly, and in that assessment, she looked for the things that mattered: the set of the jaw, the quality of the stillness, whether the eyes moved with calculation or with simple attention. All 3 of them were watching her. The tallest one in the middle was watching her the way a man watches a horizon looking for what the weather is doing. He stepped forward. He touched the brim of his hat, not a greeting exactly, more like an acknowledgement. "Miss Wren." His voice was low and without ornament, the kind of voice that did not waste itself. "I am Garrett Calloway." "Mr. Calloway." She descended the steps and stopped 2 feet from him because that was the distance that felt right. "I understand you had a question about whether my luggage was limited to what I am carrying." She had not known she was going to say that until she said it. There was a pause, then he said, "I did." "1 bag," she said. "I travel light." He looked at the bag, then he looked at her. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his face, so small she might have imagined it, and he said, "That will do," which was not a compliment and was not a welcome, but which was, she thought, an honest response, and honest responses she could work with. The man on his left was watching her with a careful, closed expression that she recognized at once. It was the face of a person who had been surprised by something before and had decided that the most sensible response to all subsequent surprises was to withhold judgment until the evidence was overwhelming. He did not introduce himself. She noted this and filed it away. The man on the right was different. He was younger than the other 2, not by much, but enough that his caution had not yet settled into architecture. He had a directness about him that was not aggressive, only present, and he stepped forward without waiting for an introduction. "Ledger Calloway," he said, and there was something slightly formal about the way he said it, like a man who has rehearsed an opening and is now discovering that the rehearsal was insufficient. "We are glad you made the journey safely." "Thank you," she said. "It is a considerable distance." "It is," he agreed. "Did you find it very long?" "I found it very wide," she said, because that was the truest thing she could say about the western half of the journey. He looked at her for a moment with something that was almost a smile, and she thought that whatever else this arrangement turned out to be, Ledger Calloway was not going to be its most difficult element. She became aware of a man watching from across the street. He was standing in front of the general store with a glass in his hand, and he was not doing anything that could be called suspicious. But she had spent enough years reading rooms to know when she was being assessed and by what kind of mind. This man was older, perhaps 50, with the settled look of someone who has made himself comfortable in a place he does not own and does not particularly intend to vacate. His eyes moved between her and the three brothers with the particular deliberateness of a man who is adding something up. She looked away. She would think about him later. The wagon to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours moving up a road that climbed steadily into the mountains and grew narrower as the elevation increased. Everett, whose name she learned only when Ledger used it in passing, handled the horses with the economy of a man who has driven this road so many times that his hands know it without being asked. Garrett sat beside him in the front facing forward and did not speak. Josephine sat in the back with Ledger, who pointed out landmarks with the air of a man who genuinely believed that other people would find the same things interesting that he found interesting. That ridge there, he said, is where the elk come down in November. You can sometimes see 30 or 40 of them in the early morning before the light is fully up. It is one of the finest things in this part of the territory. I would like to see that, she said, and she meant it. You will, he said with a certainty that was matter of fact rather than reassuring, as though there were simply no version of events in which she did not stay long enough to see it. She looked at the back of Garrett's head, at the width of his shoulders against the sky, at the deliberate stillness of a man who was accustomed to controlling what he could and enduring what he could not. She wondered what he was enduring now. The Calloway Ranch appeared after a long curve in the road, and it was larger than she had imagined, which she had not expected, and quieter than she had imagined, which she had. The main cabin was substantial, built from timber that had the gray and weathered look of boards that had been standing through many winters, and there were outbuildings arranged at practical distances in a fence line that extended out of sight in both directions. Everything about it spoke of work done steadily over a long period of time by people who intended to be here for a long time more. There were no flowers. There were no curtains in the windows. There was nothing that indicated in any way that a woman had ever had a hand in the arrangement of this place. On the porch, a woman Josephine had not been told to expect was helping two small children with their coats. She was perhaps 60, with the look of someone who had spent most of her life outdoors and had made her peace with what that did to a face. She looked up when the wagon came through the gate, and there was a complex, tired expression on her face that Josephine did not have time to interpret. The woman spoke to Garrett as he came down from the wagon. "Mr. Calloway, I am sorry to say it this way. My husband has taken ill. The fever has come back, and I cannot stay through the week as we agreed. I waited until you were back." She looked at Josephine. "I am glad the arrangement was made in time." Then she gathered her things and was gone, and Josephine understood with a clarity that arrived all at once that she had just moved from being a woman who was arriving to being a woman who was needed, and that the distinction was not a small one. And then the little girl came down the porch steps. She was small for 3, with dark hair and her father's serious face, and she walked across the yard with the particular determination of a child who has decided on a course of action and is not going to be deflected. She stopped in front of Josephine and looked up at her with large eyes that held more in them than most adult eyes Josephine had encountered. "Are you going to stay?" the child asked. The yard was very quiet. Josephine was aware of all 3 brothers behind her. She was aware of the size of the question being asked by someone too young to know it was a large one. She crouched down to the child's level. "I'm going to try my very hardest," she said. This was the truth. She had learned not to make promises she could not be certain of keeping, but she had also learned that the trying was a promise she could make and mean. The little girl considered this. Then she reached into the pocket of her small coat and took out something that turned out to be a worn bit of ribbon, faded blue, and held it out. Josephine took it. She did not know what it meant, and she did not ask. She folded it carefully and put it in her own pocket. Later, she would learn that this was the ribbon from Nora's mother's hair. that Nora had kept it for 3 years and given it to no one. That evening, after Josephine had found her way around the kitchen and produced a meal from the provisions she found there after the children had been given their supper and put to bed with more difficulty than she had anticipated and less than the night would eventually produce, Garrett called her to the front room. He was standing at the window with his arms at his sides, which was, she would come to understand, his equivalent of a man sitting with his elbows on the table. He stated the terms without preamble. She would have the small room at the end of the hall. She would manage the house, the meals, and the daily care of the children. He and his brothers managed everything outside the walls of the main cabin. The wedding, as per the placement contract, would take place within 30 days. Until that time, the terms of the household were as he had stated. He did not apologize for their plainness. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "May I add 2 conditions of my own?" The silence that followed was brief but absolute. She did not think any woman had asked him that question in this room before. "Say them," he said. First, she said, "I am not a hired woman. I understand I came through a placement office, but I am not going to allow this house to treat me as one. I will work harder than you expect, and I will ask for nothing I have not earned, but I will not be made to feel that I am here on sufferance." She held his eyes. "Second, those 2 children will be cared for according to what they need, not according to a schedule. If they need something in the night, I will be the one who goes to them. I am not asking your permission for that. I am telling you it is what I intend to do." The room was quiet enough that she could hear the wind outside finding the gaps in the chinking of the logs. Garrett Calloway looked at her for a long time with an expression she could not yet read. Then he said, "Agreed." Not easily, not warmly, but without reservation. She nodded once and returned to finish the dishes. Behind her, she did not see the way he turned back to the window, or the slight motion of his hand that might in a different light have looked like a man releasing something he had been holding for longer than was good for him. That night, Josephine sat at the small table in her room and took out the ribbon and held it for a while before she put it away. She took out the packet of seeds and set them on the windowsill where they would catch whatever morning light the mountain allowed. She took out the letter she had been writing for 3 years to her mother, the one she had never sent because there was nowhere to send it, and she added a single line. "I do not know yet if this is the place, but it is a place, and that is more than I have had." She was nearly asleep when she heard Ledger's step in the hall, soft and deliberate, stopping outside her door, and then his voice just above a whisper, "Miss Wren." She rose and opened the door an inch. He was holding a lamp low, and his face in its light had an expression that was serious in a way she had not yet seen from him, underneath the easier manner he wore during the day. "I owe you a truth," he said, "before anything else begins." She waited. "The letter to the placement office," he said. "I wrote it, not Garrett. The arrangement was my idea, not his. But I am 28 years old, and the office requires a man of 30 or more to enter a marriage contract by correspondence, or a co-signer of legal age above that threshold. Garrett is 35. He co-signed. He is the one whose name is on the documents." He paused. "Which means legally you came here as his intended, not mine." She looked at him steadily. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because," he said, "you said you were not looking for promises. You said you were looking for a place worth staying. I thought you should know exactly what kind of place you arrived at, including the parts that are complicated." There was a long quiet between them. "What made you choose me?" she said at last. "Out of however many letters you received." Ledger's expression did not change, but something in it became more direct. "Most of the letters described what the women wanted to leave," he said. "Yours was the only one that described what you were looking for." He left her with that, in the faint light of his lamp disappearing down the hall. She stood for a moment in her doorway. Then she closed the door and went back to the window and looked out at the dark shape of the mountain against the darker sky and thought about the distance between where she had been and where she was and what might or might not be possible in the space between those 2 things. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep, and the mountain did not answer her, but it did not dismiss her either, and in the morning the packet of seeds was still on the sill, catching the first pale line of the sunrise. and the children were already awake. The first morning established the terms of everything that followed. Josephine was dressed and in the kitchen before the sky had fully decided to become morning. The stove was cold, and she found the wood box beside it and the matches on the shelf above. And she had the fire going before she had properly understood the layout of the room. She worked by instinct and by the knowledge that a cold kitchen in October at this elevation was a problem that needed solving before anything else could be solved. She found flour and lard and a tin of baking powder, and she made biscuits the way Mrs. Crane had taught her, by feel rather than by measurement. And while they were in the oven, she found salt pork in the coal box and eggs from the basket near the door, and she made a breakfast that was plain and hot and ready at the exact moment she heard the first boots on the floor above her head. Ledger came down first. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the set table and the food and then at her, and his expression had the quality of a man recalibrating a prior assumption. "You did not have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. Everett came in without looking at her and poured himself coffee from the pot she had found and sat at the far end of the table. He did not acknowledge the breakfast. He also did not decline it. She registered both of these things as information worth keeping. Garrett came down last. He stood in the doorway, the way Ledger had stood, but differently, with the stillness of a man who is assessing rather than appreciating. He looked at the table, he looked at her, he sat down. He took one biscuit, then the salt pork, then the eggs. He ate everything on his plate without comment. When he was finished, he pushed back his chair and said, "The salt is heavy." "I know," Josephine said. "You ate all of it." There was a pause that had some weather in it. Then he stood, took his hat from the peg by the door, and walked out into the cold morning without another word. Ledger looked at his coffee cup with an expression that suggested he was working to keep something off his face. Everett looked at the window. Neither of them said anything, which told her more than speech would have. She cleared the table and started the washing up. This was how she learned the house. Not by being shown it, but by moving through it with attention, the way she had learned everything that had ever been worth knowing. The rooms told their own story. The kitchen was functional and had been managed by a succession of people who were trying rather than caring. The front room had a good stone fireplace and a chair positioned to face it that was worn deep on the right armrest, which meant one person had been sitting in it for years alone in the evenings. The children's room was small and crowded with the accumulated objects of two babies being lived in close quarters, and it smelled of the specific warmth of small sleeping bodies, and it had a window that faced east and caught the morning light first. She stood in that window for a moment before she made the beds. The light came over the mountain in a particular way that she had not seen before. Broad and angled and very clean, and it lay across the floor of the children's room like something that had been carefully arranged rather than simply arriving. She made the beds and went back downstairs. Nora and Edmund appeared for breakfast at the second sitting, which was a negotiation rather than a meal, because Edmund had decided that the biscuits looked suspicious, and Nora had decided that she would eat only if Edmund ate first, a standoff that Josephine resolved by the simple method of sitting down between them and eating one herself and saying nothing at all. The logic of this approach was not immediately obvious, but it worked, and within 10 minutes both children were eating with the focused intensity of 3-year-olds who had been holding out for principle rather than appetite. Josephine watched them eat and felt something she had not expected to feel so quickly, something that sat in her chest like a cold that had caught. She was careful with it. She had learned to be careful. The days found their shape through her attention to them. She was awake before the men each morning, and she had the kitchen warm before anyone came down. Not because she had been told to, but because a warm kitchen was a house saying something to the people inside it, and she wanted this house to be saying something other than what it had been saying. She cooked plain food well, which she had found was more valuable than elaborate food indifferently, and she kept the front room swept and the lamps full and the children's clothes mended as they needed mending. In the evenings, the 3 brothers came in from whatever the day had required of them, and they ate. And then Garrett usually sat with his accounts at the table, and Ledger read or worked on something with his hands, and Everett disappeared to his room, and Josephine put the children to bed, and then found a chair near the fire and did whatever small work remained, and the house held all of them in its particular quiet. It was not a comfortable quiet yet. It was the quiet of people who are still learning whether they can trust the silence they share. But it was not hostile either. It was the quiet of a foundation being laid, which is not a romantic thing, but is a necessary one. On the fourth day, the wood box was empty before noon. Josephine went to the pile behind the barn with the splitting axe she found leaning against the wall and began to work through it. She had done this before at the boarding house when the handyman was absent, and she was not unskilled. But the rounds here were larger and the axe was heavier than what she was used to, and she had been working for 20 minutes when she became aware that she was being observed. Garrett was standing at the corner of the barn. He had not made a sound. He simply appeared the way large and self-contained men sometimes appear, as though they have been present longer than you realize. "You are holding it wrong," he said, not unkindly, just accurately. She looked at her hands on the handle. "Show me." He crossed the yard and stood beside her, not in front, and did not take the axe from her. Instead, he placed one hand over hers on the handle and adjusted the angle slightly, shifting the balance point. His hands were very large and very rough, and the adjustment took perhaps 4 seconds. He stepped back. She set the axe and swung, and the round split cleanly and fell to both sides. She looked up. He had already turned away. "Thank you," she said to his retreating back. He raised one hand briefly, the way a man does when he has said what needed saying and has moved on. She stood with the axe in her hands for a moment longer than necessary, paying attention to something she was not quite ready to name. Then she went back to splitting wood. It was on the 6th evening that Harriet Dunmore arrived. She came on horseback from 14 miles down the valley, which meant she had been riding since before mid-afternoon, which meant this was not a casual visit. She was a large woman, not in height but in presence, with the kind of face that had given up prettiness in exchange for something more durable. And she dismounted with the ease of someone who had been on horseback most of her life and stepped onto the porch before Garrett had reached the door. "I heard she arrived," Harriet said. "I came to see for myself." Josephine was in the kitchen when she heard this, and she came to the doorway and said, before Garrett could respond, "I am right here if you would like to see me directly." Harriet turned and looked at her with the thoroughness of a woman who has lived long enough to know that first impressions are investments. "Smaller than I thought," she said, "for a mountain." "I have been told that before," Josephine said. "It has not yet proved to be a problem." Harriet held her gaze for a moment. Then she laughed short and real, the laugh of someone who does not laugh as a social performance. "She will do," Harriet said to no one in particular. She came in and sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee with the authority of a person who has made herself at home in this house before, and she talked about the valley and the coming winter and the state of the Beckford family's cattle, 3 ridges over which apparently had implications for everyone in the area, and Josephine listened and noted what was useful and set aside what was not. Before she left, Harriet drew Josephine to the porch under the pretext of pointing out something in the yard, which was clearly not what she wanted to say. "Wallace Pruitt," she said quietly, "in Delwood. He runs the general trade. He has been asking questions about the Callaway arrangement since before you arrived. I do not know what he is after, but Pruitt does not ask questions without a purpose, and his purposes are generally his own." She paused. "I thought you should know." Josephine looked at the dark yard. "What kind of questions?" she said. "About the legal standing of correspondence marriages, about whether the ranch is encumbered." Harriet's voice was steady and informational, a woman giving a report. "About whether there is family back east who might contest the arrangement." Josephine considered this. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate plain speaking." "So do I," Harriet said, "which is why I came." After she rode away into the dark, Josephine stood on the porch for a moment with a cold air on her face and turned what Harriet had told her over in her mind, the way she turned useful things over, finding the edges of it, and then she went inside and finished the dishes and did not mention it to anyone. Not yet. The children were the axis around which everything else turned. Josephine had known this from the first moment Nora had come across the yard with the blue ribbon. But knowing a thing and living inside it are different, and she lived inside it now, in the way that a person learns a language, not by studying grammar, but by being surrounded by it until it begins to rearrange the inside of your head. Nora was the one who came first. She had her father's quality of stillness, and her mother's quality of Josephine imagined something particular to women who had known how to fill a room without demanding it. She would appear at Josephine's elbow while she was cooking and stand there without asking anything, only present, and Josephine had learned to speak to her while she worked, not performing cheerfulness, but simply narrating, saying what she was doing and why and what it would become. And Nora absorbed this with the same seriousness she brought to everything. Edmund was different. He had the energy of a small person who has discovered that the world is full of things worth investigating and has not yet learned to modulate this discovery to the comfort of the people around him. He broke 2 cups, investigated the contents of the wood box with his hands, and on one occasion, attempted to give the barn cat a bath using the water pitcher from the kitchen. Josephine addressed each of these situations without raising her voice, which she had found was the only approach that produced anything useful with children of this particular temperament. On the 8th evening, she found Everett. She had not found him in any meaningful sense before this. He was present at meals and absent, otherwise passing through the edges of the house with the quality of a man who has decided that the house does not fully apply to him. She had not pushed. She had learned that certain kinds of closed doors require patience rather than knocking. She went to the barn after supper because she had heard one of the horses moving restlessly, and she wanted to check the water. She found Everett in the back stall alone, attempting to wrap a wound on his forearm that was longer and deeper than he had apparently let on at supper. He was managing badly. The bandage was twisted, and he was trying to use his teeth. And when she appeared in the lamplight, he stopped and looked at her with an expression that was not quite embarrassment and not quite hostility, but somewhere in the narrow territory between them. She did not ask permission. She set down her lamp and sat on the stool beside him and picked up the bandage roll he had been fighting and began to clean the wound properly with the water and the cloth she had had the presence of mind to bring from the kitchen when she heard the horse. He let her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "Where did you learn to do this?" he said at last. His voice was neutral, gathering information rather than making conversation. "My aunt's house," she said. She was unsteady on her feet, and there was no one else to attend to it. A silence. "How long were you there?" he said. 7 years. He did not say anything to that, but the quality of his stillness changed slightly, the way a man shifts his weight when he has revised an assumption. She finished the bandaging and tied it off neatly and began to put the cloth away. "The woman in the letter you have in your room," she said, not looking at him. "I found it by accident on the shelf. I put it back where I found it." The silence this time was of a different texture. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She came in the spring of last year. She was from St. Louis." Josephine waited. "She lasted 31 days, he said. She said the mountain was the loneliest place she had ever been in her life. A pause that had something in it she did not intrude upon. She was not wrong about that. Not entirely." Josephine stood and picked up her lamp. "I am not Clara," she said. "I am not from St. Louis, and I did not come here from a full life that this would be a diminishment." She looked at him directly. "I came from nothing, which means there is nothing here to compare this to that would be worse." He looked at her for a long time. "You have been here 11 days, he said. "Clara stayed 31. "I know," she said. "Come in for coffee before you sleep. The cold will tighten that arm." She left him in the barn and walked back to the house across the dark yard, and she did not look back, and behind her she heard after a moment the sound of a man standing up. He came in for coffee. He did not say anything while he drank it, but he stayed at the table until Ledger came in from checking the fence line, and the 3 of them sat in the kitchen without any of the particular strain that had been present in the early evenings, And Josephine thought that sometimes the simplest things were the ones that mattered most. It was a cold afternoon in the third week when the biscuit disaster occurred. She had been making the dough for supper, working at the kitchen table with the window behind her, open half an inch for the cool air she preferred when she was cooking, and she had her back turned when the barn cat, who had apparently been conducting a reconnaissance of the kitchen for some time, made his move from the shelf above the table to the bowl. The bowl went first, then the flour sack, which had been insufficiently closed, then in a cascade of consequence that Josephine did not fully witness, but heard entirely the tin of salt a ladle, and approximately half the morning's work went across the kitchen floor in a pale and impressive disaster. She stood and looked at it. She was covered in flour. The cat was covered in flour. The floor was covered in flour. The cat sat in the middle of it with the dignified expression of an animal who has survived worse. Ledger appeared in the doorway. He looked at the floor. He looked at the cat. He looked at Josephine. She began to laugh. Not the small, contained laugh of a woman managing a situation. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere below management, from the part of a person that has been held too tightly for too long and recognizes an absurdity large enough to release through. She laughed until her eyes were wet, and the cat regarded her with patient judgment, and the flour drifted slightly in the draft from the door. Ledger started laughing too. The sound of it was new in the kitchen, two people laughing together without irony or performance. Just the genuine article, and Josephine thought later that this was the moment the house changed, not in anything structural, but in some quality of its atmosphere, something that had been waiting to be loosened by precisely this kind of ordinary, ridiculous human moment. Garrett appeared in the doorway behind Ledger. He looked at the flour, he looked at the cat, he looked at the two of them standing in the middle of the disaster. He did not laugh, but the line between his brows, which had been present every time she had looked at him since she arrived, eased by some fraction she could not have measured, but that she noticed. He stepped over the cat, poured himself coffee, and said, "I will bring in more flour from the storeroom." "Thank you," Josephine said, still composing herself. He did not reply, but she heard the particular quality of the silence he took with him out the door, and she thought it was different from the silences that had preceded it. The evening of the 12th day brought rain that kept everyone inside, and the house held them all in the orange light of the lamps, with the sound of water on the roof and the fire moving in the hearth. Ledger was reading. Everett had brought a book from his room, which was the first time Josephine had seen him do this in the shared space, and he sat with it open on his knee near the fire. Josephine was mending a shirt of Edmund's that had given way at the shoulder seam, and the children were asleep, and the room had a quality of settled peace that she had not experienced in it before. Garrett sat at the table with his ledger as usual, but after a while he closed it and simply sat his large hands on the table in front of him, looking at nothing in particular. "My father built this place the first winter," he said. No one had spoken for some time. The sentence arrived without preamble, the way statements sometimes do from men who have been carrying them for a while. "He came up from the valley with 2 horses and a mule, and enough provisions for 1 season, and he built the main room and the chimney, and called it done for the year." He looked at the far wall. "He said a man could endure anything if he had made the thing himself, that there was no cold or difficulty that could defeat a man in a house he had built with his own hands, because the house was proof that the difficulty was manageable." Josephine set her mending down. "He sounds like a man who knew how to frame things," she said. Garrett looked at her. He was. He said that land was only truly home when someone wanted to stay in it. A pause. "I used to think he was talking about the land." Ledger had stopped reading, though he had not looked up from the page. Everett turned a page of his book that he had clearly not been reading. "My mother said something similar," Josephine said. "Not about land, about flowers. She said they would grow anywhere there was someone willing to tend them." She looked at the windowsill where the packet of seeds had been sitting since she arrived. "I believe she was using the flowers to mean something else." Garrett followed her gaze to the windowsill and then back. The fire made its small sounds. Then Everett looked up from his book and said, This is the book she left behind. He was not looking at anyone in particular, and he did not explain who she was, but Josephine understood. Clara, she said. Yes. He looked at the cover, which was turned upward in his lap. I do not read it. I have not opened it since the first month, but I have not been able to put it on the shelf either. Josephine looked at him steadily. Why not the shelf? Because putting it on the shelf means it is finished, he said. And it does not feel finished. It feels like something that stopped before it was over. She thought about that. Would you read me something from it? She said. He looked at her sharply. The first sharp look he had directed at her was something in it that was not hostile, but was very much alive. Wow, he said. Because she said, I think you have been carrying it alone long enough. And because things that stop before they are over sometimes need a witness to become finished. The room was very still. Everett looked at the book in his lap for a long time. Then he opened it to a page that was clearly not random, a page he knew, and he read 3 lines of poetry in a voice that was much quieter than his speaking voice, a voice that had something raw in its structure. And when he finished, the room held what he had read in the way a room holds things that have been said at the right time, in the right place. Josephine did not say anything immediately. She picked up her mending. After a moment, Garrett said, Put it on the shelf, Everett. Everett looked at his older brother. It is finished, Garrett said. You can honor it and let it be done. Another long quiet. Then Everett stood and crossed the room and placed the book on the shelf between 2 others, spun out the way a book belongs. He came back to his chair and sat down and picked up the book he had actually been pretending to read and began to read it in earnest. Josephine kept her eyes on her mending and felt the room shift around her in some way that she thought would be permanent. Later, when Garrett was going over his accounts again and Ledger had fallen asleep in his chair, Josephine carried the empty cups to the kitchen and stood at the window over the sink and looked at the dark mountain through the glass, and she heard Garrett's step behind her. He set his cup on the counter and stood beside her and looked out at the same dark. You will have a month before the real cold comes, he said. After that, the road to Delwood is unreliable until spring. She understood that this was not a weather report. I understand, she said. There are people in Delwood who will not make things easy for you, he said. People who have opinions about arrangements they do not understand. I have met people like that before, she said. He was quiet. Then Harriet told me Pruitt has been asking questions. She told me as well, Josephine said. He looked at her sidelong. This surprised him. He had not known she knew. You did not mention it, he said. I am mentioning it now, she said. I did not know enough yet to say anything useful. I know a little more now. She looked out at the mountain. He is not interested in me. He is interested in the land. I am only relevant to the extent that my presence here can be made legally complicated. She felt rather than saw the quality of his attention change. How did you arrive at that? He said. Because he looked at me the way men look at things they are calculating the value of, she said. And because the questions Harriet described are the questions of a man who is looking for a gap in a boundary rather than an interest in the people inside it. The silence that followed had a different texture than the others. You are observant, he said. I have had reasons to be, she said. She did not say more, and he did not ask, and they stood at the window together in the kitchen for a while longer, not touching, not speaking, but occupying the same space without either of them finding it necessary to leave, which was, Josephine thought, the beginning of something. She did not know yet what it was the beginning of, but she recognized the feeling of a beginning when she was standing in one. The following morning, Ledger found her after breakfast when the others had gone out to the fence line. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before he spoke, which was not like him. Pruitt started asking questions in Delwood the week before I wrote to the placement office, he said. I do not know how he knew. I do not know what he was told or who told him. But I knew that if a man of his kind was already asking, the answers would need to be ready before they were needed. He looked at her steadily. I have taken steps. When the time comes, you will not be without footing. She looked at him. You stood behind the choice, she said. I said I would, he said. I thought you should know that someone was standing behind this one. She held his gaze for a long moment. Thank you, Ledger, she said. He nodded once and went back to his work, and she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the mountain and thought about the particular quality of a man who prepares for the battles he sees coming before they announce themselves. The seeds on the sill had not sprouted yet. It was too cold in the wrong season, and the conditions were not yet right, but they were still there. And so was she. The evening before the wedding, the house was quiet in a way that was different from all the other quiet evenings. And Josephine sat at the kitchen table. The children were asleep and the brothers had gone to their rooms. And she wrote in the letter she had been writing to her mother for 3 years. I do not know what tomorrow will be, but I know what it is not. It is not an ending, and it is not a convenience, and it is not the last door left open after all the others have closed. I think it might be the first door I have ever walked through of my own choosing. I think that is enough to begin with. She folded the letter and put it away. Then she heard a step on the stairs, and Garrett appeared in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes, which meant he had not yet been to bed. And he looked at her sitting at the table, and she looked at him standing in the doorway. And neither of them spoke for a moment. He came in and poured water from the pitcher and drank it standing at the counter. You should sleep, he said. So should you, she said. He set the cup down. He did not leave. Are you afraid, he said. The word cost him something. She could hear it. She thought about this honestly. Of small things, she said, not of the large ones. What are the large ones? Being present in a life that does not see me, she said. That is the only large thing I have ever been afraid of. He looked at her across the kitchen in the low light of the single lamp she had left burning. I see you, he said. It was the quietest thing she had ever heard a man say, and also somehow the loudest. She held it carefully, the way that she held the ribbon, the way she held the seeds. He said goodnight and went back up the stairs, and she sat for a while longer in the kitchen with the lamp burning low and the mountain outside the window and the sound of the house breathing around her in the dark. She was not afraid. She was ready. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning in November under a sky that had not yet decided whether it intended to snow. The judge came up from Delwood on horseback, a compact man named Aldrich, who had the practice efficiency of someone who had officiated at frontier arrangements before and understood that the ceremony was not the point of them. Harriet Dunmore arrived an hour early and stationed herself in the kitchen where she made coffee and said nothing that required a response, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. Nora wore her blue dress and stood very straight, and in her hair tied with the care of a child who has decided something is important enough to be done correctly was the blue ribbon that had belonged to her mother. Edmund wore his good shirt and stood next to his sister, with his hands clasped in front of him, in unconscious imitation of his father, which Josephine noticed and which required her to look at the window for a moment to compose herself. Garrett stood at the hearth in the front room with his hat in his hands and his brothers on either side of him. And when Josephine came down the stairs in the dress she had pressed the night before, which was not a wedding dress, but was the best she owned, he looked at her with the full attention he usually reserved for things that required serious assessment. She met his eyes and held them. Judge Aldrich read the words that made the arrangement legal and permanent. When he reached the passage about having and holding in sickness and in health, Garrett repeated the words at a pace that was slower than the reading of them, as though he were taking them in rather than simply rendering them back. Josephine heard the difference. She thought perhaps Harriet heard it too from her position near the kitchen doorway. Josephine spoke her own portion clearly and without hesitation. When it was done, Aldrich closed his book and said the thing that judges say, and Garrett looked at Josephine for a moment with an expression she had not seen from him before, something that had not yet finished becoming what it was going to be. And then he looked at his children and back at her, and she understood that the expression was not incomplete. It was simply new territory for a man who had spent 3 years inside a country where nothing new had arrived. Harriet poured coffee. Ledger shook his brother's hand and then shook Josephine's, which made her smile. Everett stood near the window and watched the proceedings with the quality of a man who is paying close attention to something he will need to remember. Nora came to Josephine and took her hand without asking. That was the ceremony. That evening, Garrett led her to the large room at the end of the upper hall, which had been his room, and which was now, by the logic of what they had agreed to in front of Judge Aldrich and Gaw and Harriet Dunmore, their room. He opened the door and set the lamp on the dresser and stood for a moment with his back to her. She said his name. He turned. The mountain pressed against the window glass, close and dark and patient, and the lamp threw its amber light across everything, and the door closed against the cold that lived in the hallway. In the morning, the first snow of the season had arrived in the night and lay across everything in the particular silence that only snow produces, and the world outside the window was white and new, and the children were already awake. 3 weeks passed. They were good weeks in the way that weeks are good when the structure of daily life is working as it should, and the people inside that structure are beginning to trust it. Josephine learned the rhythms of a married household on a working ranch, which were not the rhythms she had known before, and she settled into them with the attention she brought to everything. She noticed that Garrett always walked the north fence line on his first pass of the morning, regardless of whether it needed walking, because it gave him 20 minutes alone before the day required him to be accountable to anyone. She did not comment on this. She understood it. She noticed that Everett, having put Clara's book on the shelf, had begun to read it 1 or 2 pages at a time in the evenings by the fire. He did not mention this, and she did not either. She noticed that Ledger had begun riding to Delwood more frequently than the supply schedule required, and that when he came back, he had occasionally brought small things that were not on any list: a good knife, a pair of warm gloves, in a size that fit no one currently on the ranch, and that he had started combing his hair before these trips in a way he had not previously bothered with. She said nothing about any of this. She was watching as she had always watched, but she was watching now from inside something rather than outside it, and the quality of her attention had changed accordingly. It was on a Wednesday afternoon in the 4th week that Harriet arrived again, this time without the casual ease of her first visit. She dismounted at the gate and tied her horse and came to the house with the particular purposeful walk of a woman who is carrying news she did not choose to carry. Garrett was in the barn. She went to him directly. Josephine in the kitchen heard the murmur of their voices through the wall and continued with her work. When Garrett came inside, the set of his shoulders told her what she needed to know before he spoke. Wallace Pruitt had retained a lawyer from Helena. He had filed a preliminary inquiry with the territorial court regarding the legal standing of correspondence marriages when entered into without a verified guardian's consent for the female party. He had specified the Calloway arrangement by name. He had requested a hearing at the court in Delwood within 30 days. Garrett told her this standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands again, which was the posture she had come to recognize as the one he took when he was telling her something he would rather not have to tell her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How long have you known about the land provision in your father's will?" He looked at her. "The 80 acres on the north boundary," she said. "The provision that designates them as the dowry of the wife of the eldest son upon legal marriage. I found the reference in the property abstract you left on the table last week. I read it." She held his eyes. "Pruitt is not interested in the marriage. He is interested in what dissolving the marriage before 6 months would do to the title of that land." Garrett was quiet. "I am not angry," she said. "I am telling you that I understand what is actually happening, which means we should discuss it as what it actually is rather than as something else." He pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table, which was not something he had done in the middle of a working day before. "My father put that provision in 20 years ago," he said. "He told me about it when I married Ruth. He said he wanted to be sure that whoever his sons brought into this family had a legal stake in the land, that they could not be removed without consequence." A long pause. He was a man who thought about the long term. He was a man who had seen what happened to women who had no legal footing, Josephine said. Garrett looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "Yes," he said. "I think that is what he saw. That evening, Ledger found Josephine after supper and placed an envelope in her hands with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been waiting for the right moment. Inside was a certified copy of her birth record from the city of Philadelphia, notarized and stamped, confirming her name, her parentage, and her date of birth. She had turned 21 4 months before she signed the placement contract. Under the territorial statutes of Montana Territory as amended in 1875, a woman of 21 years or older was considered a legal adult capable of entering binding contracts without parental or guardian consent. There was no gap in the boundary. Pruitt had been building his case on ground that did not exist. She looked at Ledger. "The steps you said you had taken," she said. "This is what you meant." "Among other things," he said, "I wrote to the records office in Philadelphia 3 weeks before you arrived. I wrote to a lawyer in Helena the week after Pruitt filed. The territorial statute has been in effect since 1875. Goss will find nothing to work with." She looked at the certificate in her hands. "You stood behind the choice before you even knew what I looked like," she said. "I knew what you wrote," he said. "That was enough." She folded the document carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her dress, close to the letter she had been writing to her mother and the ribbon Nora had given her on the first day, all the things she carried that mattered. The hearing was scheduled for the second week of December. Between the notice of the hearing and its arrival, the mountain delivered its own commentary on the situation in the form of weather. The storm came on a Saturday earlier and harder than anyone had predicted. The kind of storm that announces itself on the horizon in the afternoon and arrives with full force before supper. Garrett and Everett had gone up to the high pasture that morning to bring the last of the cattle down before the weather turned. Ledger was in the near barn reinforcing the south wall where the boards had loosened. Josephine was in the kitchen with the children. She heard the wind change an hour before the snow arrived. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 20 minutes, which she felt through the kitchen walls, and she put more wood on the fire and pulled the children back from the windows and listened to the storm build. Then Edmund said, "The cat is outside." She turned around. Both children were at the kitchen door, which was standing open 3 inches. In the draft from the door, flour was moving gently across the table. Nora said in the precise tone of a child reporting facts without editorial content, "We opened it to look for the cat, and then the wind took it, and we could not pull it back, and then Edmund went out to get the cat, and now Edmund is outside." Josephine was at the door before Nora finished the sentence. The snow was coming horizontally in the first hard gust of the main body of the storm, and Edmund was standing 6 feet from the kitchen door with the cat in his arms and the expression of a child who has accomplished his objective and is only now becoming aware of the full context. He was in his house clothes. No coat. She went out. She did not stop to get her coat either. She crossed the 6 feet of ground between the door and her son and picked him up with the cat between them and turned back toward the house. And the door, caught by the wind, swung fully open and then cracked back against the frame, and she got through it and kicked it shut behind her and stood in the kitchen with Edmund and the cat pressed against her chest, all 3 of them breathing hard. Edmund said in a very small voice, "I saved the cat." "You did," she said. "You also frightened me very much." "I am sorry," he said. "I know," she said. "Come here." She sat on the kitchen floor, which she had not planned to do, and held both children against her with the cat between all 3 of them, and she could feel their hearts beating small and rapid and entirely present, and the storm worked itself against the walls of the house with the sound of something that wanted inside. She was holding them like that when Garrett opened the back door. He and Everett had made it down from the high pasture ahead of the worst of it, which was not luck, so much as the particular competence of men who had been reading mountain weather for 15 years. And he came through the door with snow on his shoulders and his face hard from the cold, and stopped when he saw her on the floor. She looked up at him. Edmund said, "Papa, I saved the cat." Garrett stood in the doorway and looked at his son and his daughter and his wife sitting on the kitchen floor in the stormlight, all of them pressed together and safe, and something moved across his face that he did not try to contain or manage. which was the first time she had seen him fail to do either. He crossed the kitchen and crouched down in front of them. He put one large hand on Edmund's head, then one on Nora's. Then he looked at Josephine, who was close enough that she could see the cold in his skin and the snow still melting at his temple, and he said in a voice that was lower than his usual register, "Are you all right?" It was not quite a question. It was more like a man confirming something he needed to confirm. "We are fine," she said, "all of us." He stayed crouched in front of them for a moment longer than the confirmation required. Then he stood and said, in his ordinary voice, "Edmund, let the cat down. Nora, the fire needs wood. Everett," he said to his brother, who had come in behind him, "check the south wall of the barn." The children moved. Everett moved. The storm pressed against the windows, and the house held. Josephine stayed on the floor for one more moment before she rose to start supper. That night, after the children were in bed and the storm had settled into its working rhythm against the house, Garrett came and found her at the kitchen table where she had been sitting with her letter. And this time when he came in, he did not go to the water pitcher. He sat down across from her. The lamp between them was very low. "Ruth died at the end of October," he said. She set her pen down. "3 years ago this fall," he said. "The twins came early. There was no doctor close enough." He looked at the lamp. She had been afraid of exactly that. She had told me in the summer that she was afraid of exactly that, and I told her everything would be fine because that is what you tell someone when you cannot stand the alternative. His jaw was tight with the effort of saying it plainly. Everything was not fine. She did not say anything. She understood that what he needed was not response. It was witness. "I have not said that to anyone," he said, "that she was afraid and I told her not to be." "You believed it when you said it," Josephine said quietly. "I believed it. Yes." He looked at his hands. Belief did not make it true. The fire made its sounds. The storm made its sounds. The house held both. "I lost a child," Josephine said. "Before I came here, a boy in the 7th month." She did not look away from him. "I never said his name out loud to anyone, not once, not to any living person." Garrett looked at her across the lamp. "I called him Thomas," she said. "After my father, I never told anyone because there was no one to tell, and saying it into an empty room felt like it would only make the emptiness larger." She had not planned to say this. It had been inside her for 3 years, folded and quiet and maintained at a careful distance from anything that might require it to be spoken. And now here it was in the kitchen of the Callaway Ranch in a November storm, given to this man across a low lamp. "Thomas," Garrett said, "just that. Just the name returned to the air where it belonged. Something released in her chest that she had not known was held." "The doctor said it was unlikely I could have another," she said. "I do not know if that is true. I have not tested the question." She looked at him directly. "I thought you should know." He held her gaze with the steadiness that was his most fundamental quality. "Nora and Edmund are not lacking for a mother," he said. "Whatever else comes or does not come, they are not lacking for that." She looked at him for a long time. "No," she said, "they are not." He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. He did not squeeze. He did not say anything further. He simply put his hand there, which was the largest gesture she had ever seen from him, and they sat with the storm outside and the fire inside and the low lamp between them. And after a while, she turned her hand over under his so that their palms were together. The lamp burned down to almost nothing. Neither of them moved to raise it. Before she rose from the table, he reached out and touched her face with one rough hand, briefly, carefully, the way a man touches something he has only just understood the value of. She did not move away. The storm pressed against the walls, and the house held them both, and the lamp went dark, and the mountain kept its long, patient watch over all of it, in the way it kept watch over everything that happened on its face, old and silent and entirely present. The hearing in Delwood was on a Thursday. All 4 of them made the ride down together in the wagon through a pale and frozen morning, and Josephine sat beside Garrett with the certified documents in her coat pocket and Ledger's steady presence behind her. and she looked at the mountain as they descended and thought that she had come a considerable distance from a train platform in Philadelphia with one bag and a packet of seeds, and that the distance was not only geographic. The hearing was held in the back room of the Delwood Courthouse, which was also used as a storeroom for the clerk's office and smelled accordingly. Wallace Pruitt was there with a lawyer named Goss from Helena, a thin man with a careful manner who had the look of someone who charges by the word. Harriet Dunmore was seated along the wall with three other residents of the valley who had come on their own accord without being asked, which told Josephine something about Harriet and something about the valley. Judge Aldrich, who had married them 3 weeks earlier, presided with the impartiality of a man who has no stake in the outcome and intends to keep it that way. Goss laid out the argument in careful and technical language. The correspondence marriage had been contracted without a verified guardian's consent for the female party. Under certain precedents in territorial law, such arrangements could be challenged as procedurally deficient. He requested a formal review. Ledger stood. He presented the certified birth record, the territorial statute of 1875, and a written summary of the legal precedent that applied, which he had spent 3 weeks preparing with the help of a lawyer in Helena, whom he had written to before any of this became public. His presentation was brief and exact and left no procedural gap that Goss could reasonably exploit. Aldrich reviewed the documents. Goss leaned toward Pruitt and said something in a low voice. Pruitt's expression did not change, but he shook his head slightly. Whatever gap he had hoped to find in the arrangement, the certified documents had closed it before he could name it. Then Pruitt stood. He did not address the legal points. He shifted ground, which is what men do when the ground they chose is gone, and he suggested in language that was careful enough to avoid being actionable that there were questions about Josephine's history in Philadelphia that might bear on her character and fitness for the arrangement she had entered. The room was quiet. Josephine stood. She did not look at Garrett or Ledger or Harriet. She looked at Wallace Pruitt. I worked in the kitchen of Mrs. Elspeth Crane's boarding house on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia for 14 months, she said. Mrs. Crane would confirm this by telegraph today if you care to request it. The establishment was respectable, and my position in it was the same. She paused. If you have a specific question about my history, Mr. Pruitt, I would invite you to ask it plainly rather than by implication. This is a courtroom, as you noted when you brought your proceedings here. Plain language seems appropriate. Pruitt looked at her. She looked back. He said nothing further. Judge Aldrich set down the documents and removed his spectacles and said in the flat tone of a man who has reached a conclusion he intends to state once, I find no procedural deficiency in the marriage recorded on the 14th of November between Garrett Calloway and Josephine Wren Calloway. The arrangement stands. This inquiry is closed. Goss gathered his papers. Pruitt stood with his hat in his hands and said nothing and looked at no one and left the room with the particular quality of a man who has lost something he was not entitled to in the first place. Harriet made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Outside on the courthouse steps in the cold December air, Garrett stood beside Josephine and looked out at the main street of Delwood and said nothing for a moment. Then he put his hand on her shoulder. Not a grip, not a gesture of relief, just his hand on her shoulder, steady and deliberate, in front of Harriet and Ledger and Everett and whoever else on Delwood's main street happened to be paying attention. Everett said quietly on the walk back to the wagon, she won it before we walked in. She won it the day she stood up in front of the town and told the truth. Ledger looked at Josephine. You were home a long time before today, he said. Today is just when everyone else found out. 2 weeks later, on a night in late December when the mountain was deep in its winter and the road to Delwood had closed under 4 feet of snow, Josephine woke to silence. This was wrong. She lay still for a moment and listened to the particular quality of it and understood what the silence meant. The children had been restless at bedtime, both of them warm to the touch, with the beginning of a winter fever, and she had checked them twice in the evening and both times found them sleeping fitfully, but sleeping. Now the house had the quality of silence that is not peace but absence. She was out of the bed before the thought completed itself. The children's room was empty. The window which she had latched herself at sundown was latched. The door was shut. She went to the door and opened it and looked down the hall and saw at the far end that the back door of the house was standing open 2 inches, and through that 2 inches came cold air and the pale light of snow. In the snow outside the back door, 2 sets of small footprints led away from the house, and beside them, overlapping and obscuring some of the smaller prints, the deeper marks of boots that belonged to an adult. The sound she made woke Garrett before she reached the bedroom door. He was dressed in 40 seconds. He took one look at her face and then one look at the open door at the end of the hall, and his own face became something she had not seen before, stripped entirely of the management and the restraint, the face of a father who understands what he is looking at. He woke his brothers without raising his voice. The four of them followed the tracks in the snow by lamplight, Garrett in front moving at a pace that was not quite a run, but was everything a run is except the name. The tracks led north away from the house and the barn and the fence line toward the tree line that marked the edge of the high property. 2 miles in the cold, Josephine kept up. No one suggested she should not. They found the old trapper's shelter at the base of the first ridge, a structure that had been standing since before any of them had been on this mountain, 3 walls and a partial roof, and a door that had long since lost its hardware. A lamp was burning inside, visible through the gap where the door hung. Garrett pushed the door open. Wallace Pruitt was standing against the far wall with a lamp in one hand. Beside him was a man Josephine had not seen before, broad and rough-faced, holding the children by their arms. Nora was not crying. She was looking at her father with the steady eyes of a child who has decided that help has arrived and is waiting for it to act. Edmund was crying quietly without the energy of fresh fear. The crying of a child who has been frightened for some time and is running low. There was a third man in the room to Pruitt's left with a rifle. Ledger stepped into the doorway behind Garrett and to the left. Everett stepped to the right. They did not speak. They did not need to. Pruitt said, "I only wanted to talk. There was no need for this to become what it became." Garrett said nothing. The man with the rifle looked at the 3 brothers filling the doorway, and then at Pruitt, and then back at the brothers, and he made the calculation that men in his position make when the numbers stop working in their favor. He set the rifle against the wall. "Not enough money in the territory for this," he said, and went through the gap beside the door and was gone into the dark. The man holding the children released them. Josephine was already moving. She crossed the room in 4 steps and gathered both children against her, one arm around each, pressing them into her sides, and she felt them grip the fabric of her coat with their small, cold hands, and she felt Edmund's crying ease against her ribs. "Mama's here," she said. "Mama is right here." She did not think about the word. It arrived on its own, the way true things do when the conditions are finally right for them, and she did not take it back because there was nothing to take back. It was the truth. It had been the truth for longer than she had been willing to name it in the daylight. Behind her, Garrett's voice said to Pruitt, with a quietness that was more absolute than anything loud could have been, "You have until morning to be off this mountain." Pruitt left. The man who had been holding the children left. Garrett crossed the room and crouched in front of Nora and Edmund, who were still pressed against Josephine's sides, and he looked at them with the expression she had seen on the courthouse steps, the face beneath the management, the face of a man who has counted what he nearly lost. He put his arms around all 3 of them. Just that, just his arms around his children and his wife in the cold remains of a trapper's shelter on the mountain. His father had built his life on with his brothers, standing at the door and the snow falling outside in the dark. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Wallace Pruitt left Delwood before the new year. His store was boarded up by January, and the word that came back through Harriet was that he had relocated to the Eastern Territories, which was far enough. Harriet reported this with the satisfaction of a woman who has seen several versions of this story and prefers this ending to most of them. In March, the road opened. In April, the ground thawed enough to work. Josephine planted the seeds on the south side of the house where the light was best, and the wind came from the wrong direction to damage the seedlings. She dug the bed herself with a small spade she had found in the barn, and she turned the earth carefully and tamped it down and made the rows her mother had shown her and pressed the seeds in one by one. Garrett watched her from the fence he was repairing nearby. She did not ask him to help. He did not offer. But when she finished and stood and brushed her hands on her trousers, he said without looking up from his work, "The south side gets afternoon shadow from the barn roof in August. You may want to move the bed 6 feet east." She looked at where he was indicating. He was right. She moved the bed 6 feet east. In May, Ledger brought Gwendolyn Fitch home for Sunday supper for the first time, which surprised no one who had been paying attention. Gwendolyn was the daughter of the Delwood blacksmith, a young woman with red hair and strong opinions about horses, which made her a natural fit for the company she was keeping. Josephine cooked the best meal she had made since arriving on the mountain, not because she was asked to, but because first impressions matter. And she had not forgotten what it meant to be the new person at a table that was not yet yours. After supper, Ledger walked Gwendolyn out to see the horses, which was not actually about the horses, and Everett watched them go with a complicated expression that resolved eventually into something like contentment. In September, Everett rode to Helena on business that turned out to include several visits to the city's small lending library where a woman named Rosalind Tate was employed as the assistant librarian and had strong opinions about poetry. He came home from the third visit with a book she had recommended and an expression that Josephine recognized immediately, having seen its approximate equivalent in her mirror at a certain point in the winter. She did not say anything about it. She thought she might not need to. The following spring brought the flowers. They came up yellow and white, crowding the bed she had moved 6 feet east at Garrett's suggestion, and they were not elegant flowers, not the kind that appear in the formal gardens of eastern cities, but they were alive and bright and entirely themselves, and they bloomed against the gray of the mountain with the confidence of something that had always belonged there and simply needed the right conditions to demonstrate it. Edmund stood at the edge of the bed and said, with the assessment of a 4-year-old who has developed opinions, "They are not very big." "They are exactly the size they are supposed to be," Josephine said. "Papa's fence posts are bigger," he said. "Most things are bigger than flowers," she said. "That is not the point of them." He considered this for a moment with the seriousness he brought to difficult propositions. Then he said, "What is the point of them?" She crouched down beside him and looked at the flowers in the morning light. "To be here," she said, "to grow in the place where someone decided to put them and to be exactly what they are." She looked at her son's face, which had his father's jaw, and his mother Ruth's eyes, which she had figured out by the second month from the small portrait on the mantelpiece. "That is enough to be." Edmund looked at the flowers for a long time. "I think they are nice," he said finally, which she understood was a concession. "She is 50 years old in the autumn of 1901, and the morning light comes over Callaway Mountain the same way it always has, broad and angled and very clean, falling first across the east window of the large upstairs room, and then across the kitchen, and then out into the yard where the flower bed has spread well beyond its original dimensions and encroaches now on the fence line in a way that Garrett has never moved to stop. The ranch is large now. It has grown the way things grow when they are tended with consistency and patience, not in dramatic leaps, but in the steady accumulation of seasons. And it is recognized in the valley and beyond it as a place where the work is done right. And the word of the people who run it means what it says. Nora is 28 and lives 20 miles east with her husband and 2 children of her own, and she comes home 4 times a year and stays a week each time and fills the house with a noise that Josephine has come to understand is one of the specific sounds of a life that has gone right. Edmund is reading law in Helena and writes letters home every 2 weeks with the regularity of a man who has inherited his father's quality of keeping his word, and he comes home in summers and works the ranch with the easy competence of someone who grew up knowing how. Ledger and Gwendolyn have 4 children and live 8 miles down the valley and come for Sunday supper, most weeks the 4 children arriving at the table with the contained chaos of young people who know they are welcome and have decided to make full use of that knowledge. Everett and Rosalind live in the small cabin near the main house, which Everett built on the east side when they married, where the library they have accumulated between them has outgrown every wall and begun to colonize the floor. They come to supper every evening. They argue about books in the comfortable way of people who have been arguing about books for 20 years and expect to continue for 20 more. Harriet Dunmore died in the spring of '98 at 79 in her own house, which was how she would have chosen it. Josephine rode the 14 miles alone to sit with her at the end because Harriet had ridden 14 miles in the dark to stand in a kitchen and tell a young woman the truth about a man named Pruitt, and some debts are repaid in kind or not at all. She had buried on the hill above her own valley, which she said in her later years was the finest view in the territory, and she was right as she generally was about things she had had 20 years to consider. On a Thursday afternoon in October, Josephine is standing in the flower bed, pulling the last of the summer's growth before the frost takes it, and her granddaughter, who is 4 years old and is named Harriet after the woman who rode 14 miles in the dark, comes running across the yard from the direction of the barn. Grandma Josie, the child says, which is what she calls her and has always called her, and which Josephine has never corrected. "Where are you from?" Josephine looks up from the bed. The mountain is behind her, enormous and ancient in particular, wearing the first snow of the season on its high places, the same snow that falls every year on the same peaks and means the same things it has always meant to the people who live in its shadow. The yard is full of the accumulated evidence of a life built from the ground up with two hands and the willingness to stay. The fence Garrett repaired while she planted. The kitchen window where she stood on her first morning and watched the light come over the ridge. The porch where three brothers stood on a November morning and became in the presence of a judge and a woman with a packet of seeds in her pocket something more than they had been. She looks at her granddaughter's face, which is 4 years old and absolutely serious, waiting for an answer. She sets down her trowel. She says, "I am from here, Harriet. I have always been from here." The child considers this. Then she runs back toward the barn, satisfied, and Josephine stands in the flower bed in the October light and looks out at the mountain that watched her arrive 25 years ago, with one bag and no certainty, and a name she had never said aloud. And she says the name now quietly, as she does sometimes when she is alone in the yard. Thomas. Just that. Just the name given back to the air where it has always belonged on the mountain that remembers everything that has kept its patient witnesses through every winter and every spring and every season of what it means to be a person who decided to stay. The light moves across the yard in the way it always has. The flowers are going to seed. The mountain does not answer. It does not need to. She goes inside to start supper.